Right, a very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You're most welcome to our fraud webinar series webinar episode. And this is just one out of 4 episodes that we've prepared to walk you through in the next couple of weeks. We see that a number of people are already joining, and we'll give them just about 5 minutes to allow the numbers grow to a point where we can start. We've come to learn that a couple of people set their alarms at the exact time of the webinar. If it's at 2:30, they set it for 2:30. So the alarms go for 2:30, and then they try to get on in the next 2-3 minutes, for some 5, depending on where they are. So we will give them a few minutes to accommodate that. And at exactly 2:35 East African time, we will be starting. Otherwise, I see that we have a number of familiar faces in the room already, and a few names that I might not know, that are not very common. So I'll ask us to go ahead and introduce ourselves in the chat section. Just tell us your name, which country you're tuning in from, and the organization that you are representing. And if time allows, maybe, just maybe, we will incline some of the examples to speak to your industry. Otherwise, you're most welcome. I already see Chirag Shah. Chirag, it's a pleasure to have you here. We have Raji from Dubai. It's a pleasure to have you. I see Raji asking how long the session is going to be. We anticipate to have this go for about an hour and a half. Depending on the questions that we will have. But otherwise, it's an hour and a half. I see Jean from NRC in the DRC. Jean, it's a pleasure to have you. It's a pleasure to have you here. I see Richard from SBM Bank, Kenya. Good to have you. I see Ochan from Binzika Poultry International. Godfrey, it's good to have you, and I've seen a big team from Binzika. You're welcome. Okay, Raji goes ahead and introduces his former workplace. He says, I used to work at HSBC. It's good to have you. I see Anne from Uganda. Anne, thank you for joining. We have CPA Owusu from Nairobi. You're welcome. Adrian from World Vision Uganda, you're welcome. I see Jude from Renu. I also know we have a big team from Renu. I see Nena Shah. Good, let's keep these introductions coming. Don't forget the entity that you represent. We just might need to incline some of the examples to speak to your specific industry. Okay, I see Rosemary from St. Francis Hospital in Zambia. Good to have you here, Rosemary. I see someone from Tasso. It's good that we have people from all sectors. I think that fraud is an element that potentially affects all the sectors. So we're happy to see that we have representation from as many sectors as there can be. I see Suzanne, our good friend from ICPAU, it's good to have you here. Grace, you're welcome. Right, so I guess we've given the participants enough time to join. So once again, it's a pleasure for us to have all of you here to come and learn about fraud and polish our knowledge about fraud here and there. And one of the interesting things about fraud is that we always know about fraud, but we choose to assume that it can happen to anyone else and any organization rather than our own until it actually strikes. Then we begin to panic to try and find solutions and find ways to mitigate the impact of the fraud. But at times, so much has been lost at that time, and there's not a lot that you can save. And partly, as a firm, that is why we think it's important for us to now begin having deliberate conversations on how our clients, prospects, stakeholders can strengthen internal operating systems to, one, be able to prevent frauds, but two, to minimize the impact as and when they happen. And so partly that is why we are introducing this series of webinars. And we are certain that there's going to be so much for all of us to learn along the way. But before that, as always, I will introduce the regional CEO. I'll invite the regional CEO, Mr. Sandeep Kapri, to say a word or two as a way of officially opening this series, and then we'll move forward with our presentations for the day. Sandeep, you're most welcome.
Thank you, Moses. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and a warm welcome to all of you. It's really fantastic to see more than 183 participants already. It keeps fluctuating, but it's all going all north. So thank you very much for all your time. On behalf of BDO East Africa, I would like to welcome you to the first of the series of 4 webinars on the topic of fraud risk management. So my name is Sandeep Kapre, as I was introduced. I'm the CEO, the regional CEO of BDO in East Africa, and I look after Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, and Ethiopia. But I'm also closely associated with the Mauritius, Madagascar, and Seychelles team. As you are aware, BDO is the 5th largest professional services firm in the world with more than $12 billion turnover and a workforce of close to 100,000 globally. We in BDO East Africa, if I take Mauritius also into account, we are close to 1,500 professionals. And so that's a fairly large practice across these 10 jurisdictions we're talking about. We are soon, and I believe there's one participant from DRC, and we are soon going to implant ourselves in the DRC as well. So we are a very, very active network in bringing best practices to our clients and to our the industry for their betterment and growth. The Fraud Risk Management webinar series is one step in that direction. And of course, I don't want to steal the speaker's thunder, but just to give you a bit of a background, in which I'm sure all of us are quite aware of, that fraud is as old as human beings, but it has evolved from over the centuries from a more limited kind of an undertaking marked by a few famous cases to a widespread endeavor enabled by technology that nets trillions of dollars a year for the ever-growing number of fraudsters who have made fraud their main earning mainstay. Fraudsters are even sharing their success on the darknet and recruiting others to follow in their ways. In East Africa, it has long been recognized that corruption and fraud lurk at the very heart of our businesses, and if unchecked, could well undo the gains and hard work of the citizens of East Africa. Now, more than ever, people, companies, institutions, and governments must stem this vice of corruption and fraud. This series of webinars is BDO's way of sharing the latest research and best practices in this field with its clients, as well as anyone else that will benefit, so that they can take the lessons back to their organization, their boards, management, and employees. Creating fraud awareness is one of the key milestones in the fight against fraud. I'm especially delighted that, now let me just look at the numbers, 200 participants who have joined us from all over East Africa, including directors, business owners, law enforcement agents, lawyers, internal auditors, senior managers, as well as line management from various diverse range of industries and sectors. I have not only seen people here from Africa, I've seen some people from Asia, I've seen somebody logging in from Pakistan as well. So BDO in East Africa has an established forensic services unit, and we have helped many clients curtail their losses through fraud detection, redeploy resources to productive trade and improve profit. We've also helped them create case files to help prosecutors convict fraudsters and recover stolen wealth. We aim to be leaders in this area, and we've partnered with BDO offices in Mauritius and South Africa, which employs over 100 professionals committed to providing forensic services throughout Africa. I would now like to welcome Mr. Zahir Sheikh, the partner in charge of risk advisory, internal audit, and forensic services, to take you through the rest of the webinar, which I'm confident will provide deep insights into the topic of fraud risk management. Over to you, Zahir.
Thank you so much, Sandeep, and I hope you're keeping well. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon to all of you from all different parts of the world. It's afternoon in East Africa. My name is Zahir Sheikh, and I'm very pleased to be hosting you today. Fraud, as you know, is a major nuisance to organizations. Organizations worldwide lose 5% to fraud annually, and that's 5% on the top line, so it's a lot more on the bottom line. And one of the things I'd like to do to start off is to put us into context. When we're dealing with fraud, what are we really dealing with? And in my opinion, it's a bit like going to war. So I'd like to start off not just with concepts, but with an actual example that brings to heart what we're dealing with. So I have a scenario, and I want all of you to sit back and to imagine yourselves in this scenario. Right. So we're in a building, and you are with some people that you know and some people that you don't know. There's lots of people in this building, and you're in there with them. Then you're told somebody is out to get you. And once they do, they are going to take you out of the building. This building has lots of rooms. Some of them are well lit, and some of them are dark. And there's people in all those rooms doing various things. Your objective is to remain safe as long as you can. It's basically to survive. So let me ask you, how do you feel at the moment, knowing that somebody is out to get you, and knowing that if they do, they're going to take you out of that building? At this point, are you able to let your guard down? You know you're going to be attacked. It's just a question of who, how, and when. So, do you think it's going to be life as usual from now on? And I guess the answer to that is no, it's not. You know, things have taken a turn for the worse. So, you begin to look around carefully. You start to scan everything around you. You start to look at the people. Do I really know these people? Some of the faces are familiar. You've been working with them for years. And some of the faces are not so familiar. Perhaps they've just recently joined, and they might just be some strangers. And you're thinking to yourself, wow, I've got to be prepared. This attack could come from anywhere. You continue to scan around you. You're looking at people's faces, and you're thinking, does anyone look suspicious? You start looking at their clothes, at what they're wearing, to see if there's any bulges. Anybody carrying weapons? Can you see any signs that somebody's carrying weapons? And then you look at where you're standing. Are you in a well-lit area? Is anybody approaching you? The next thing you do is you look at yourself. Are you armed? How are you going to defend yourself? Are your critical parts protected from attack? For example, your head, your neck, your heart. And are you in a safe place? You then try and think, and you put yourself in the attacker's shoes. How are they going to attack you? And how are they going to remove you from the building? Are they going to use a knife to attack you, or a gun, or a rope? And once they have, how are they going to get you out of the building? The building has cameras, it's got various doors. Some of the doors are guarded, some of them are not. Some parts of the building are dark, some parts are light. So how are they going to get you out? And Worse still, how did they manage to get into the building in the first place? So how are these guys here? You then start weighing your options. What do? Do you wait until you're attacked? Or do you do something about it now? You decide waiting is too risky. If I wait, I may not survive this attack. And worse still, if I'm attacked and they get me out of this building, all hope might be lost. I mean, who am I going to turn to once I'm out of the building? At least in the building, I have some control. So you decide, we've got to get this guy before he gets you. So you begin to act. You alert everyone that there may be an attacker amongst you. You also remember there's a Rambo kind of guy in the building with survival skills. And you look for him and you find him and you ask him for his help. And then you go room by room looking for the guy because you want to find him. So why did I take us through this scenario? And the main reason is, fraud tends to be an abstract concept until we're actually hit with it. If you speak to somebody who's been hit with 1, 2, maybe 3 frauds, you'll see it's a very frightening situation. It can turn everything upside down. And to put it in the famous words of the Chinese military strategist Sun Tzu, if you know your enemy and you know yourself, you need not fear the outcome of 100 battles. So let's put this into context. What does this scenario mean for us? So first of all, who are you? Well, you are the assets in your organization, whether it's cash, bank, inventory, soft assets, intellectual capital. That's you. And the people around you, those you know and you don't know, that's your organization. You're going to know some of them very well because you've worked with them for years. Some of them will be personal friends, and some of them you won't know. They'll have kept their distance, or you just never got to know them, and they're going to be strangers to you. Someone is out to get you. You ask the question, why? Why is this person out to get me? What have I done to deserve this? And what we should be looking at, really, for our organizations is the tone of the top at the top. If you have fraud, that's the first thing you need to look at. Do we have a culture that's not conducive to proper behavior? Are we not living our values? Do we have favoritism in our organization or nepotism? What about the top positions? Are all of those top positions given to one tribe or one race? Or are you just an easy target? You've got too much trust and you've got too little controls. And then when you think about how they're going to take you out of the building, this is how fraudsters conceal their frauds. So we need to learn about concealment methods. How are they going to get away with it? Because for a fraudster, if he's caught, that's the end. He's only successful as long as he gets away with it. So they come up with ingenious concealment ways. The next thing, the building has lots of rooms, and some are dark and some are well lit. This is really your opportunity versus controls, because that's what fraudsters exploit. They exploit the opportunities in the organization. And some of our controls are going to be strong, and some of them are not going to be so strong. And we all know this is true in our organizations. So our objective here is to minimize fraud and fraud losses and the resultant damage. And we know that the damage can be devastating. We've seen lots of organizations collapse and disappear. We've seen job losses. We've seen organizations that have had reputational damage and have never recovered from that reputational damage. We've had organizations where the confidence is lost from customers, and they don't recover from that. So really, that's what we're talking about. When you talk about being safe, you've got to be safe from fraud, and it's got to be a long-term strategy. It's got to be something you do every day. So how do you feel safe? Can you let your guard down? This is looking at fraud risk assessments. Do we understand our risks? Have we evaluated our risks on a yearly basis? And have we tested them? And when we're looking around and scanning around you, we're looking at everything. We're looking at essentially our risks, our fraud risks, as well as all of our other risks. When we were looking at scanning, particularly looking at the people, what were we looking for? We're looking for red flags. So we need to understand and we need to recognize these red flags when they happen. And when we look at perpetrators, you will see some of these red flags. And in fact, some of our background checks reveal red flags, but the perpetrators are still let into the organization. And then we look at ourselves, and that's really our fraud prevention plan. Are we armed? Are all of our critical paths properly addressed? You know, can we be hit from fraud? And when we put ourselves in the attacker's shoes, what are we doing? We're looking at fraud risk assessment from the attacker's point of view. And one of the things that we're going to look at today is the fraud taxonomy, which is basically the different types of frauds that can happen in your organization and how you can deal with that. And how they're going to remove you from the building. In order for you to stop that, obviously, periodic testing of internal controls, reconciliations, oversight, proper segregation of duties, particularly in the critical areas. And how did they manage to get into the building in the first place? This is where our background checks have failed. And sometimes the background checks reveal something fishy about the person you're going to employ, but either it's not done or it's ignored, and the fraudster thereby gains entry into the organization. And your options, you could wait, and that's the reactive approach. Many organizations have found out that this is a very expensive approach, or you could do something about it now, which is being proactive about fraud. Waiting is obviously too risky because fraud losses can be very big. We can have business disruption, reputation, we just talked about it. And if they get you out of the building, if your asset leaves, then asset recovery is going to be very, very difficult and very expensive and very lengthy. So when you alert your employees, basically what you've done is you've told them that they've got to blow the whistle, and you've created awareness amongst them. And this is what we have to do. We have to create awareness about frauds and the risk of fraud in our organizations. And you can guess who the Rambo was in this story. So, ladies and gentlemen, having put everything into context, let me just take you through the agenda for today. We're going to look at the fraudster and the fraud environment. Then I'm going to take you through the ACFE report 2022. We'll look at the key findings. Then we'll look at occupational fraud as it happens in our organization. And we'll look at the fraud taxonomy. We'll look at some fraud schemes in sub-Saharan Africa. And then we'll go and look at the profile of a fraudster. And that's all we're going to have time for in this session. In our next session, we're going to look at the red flags, the early warning signs of fraud, and how we recognize those red flags. We're going to look at victim organizations, what are their characteristics, fraud detection and anti-fraud controls, and we'll look at case results. These are results from actual cases that were investigated, and what was the outcome? Did they recover any money? Was it civil litigation? Was there a criminal case? And so on. And we'll look at how to minimize fraud risk. Hopefully in the next webinar, we can also do an online survey, and I encourage all of you to come and to bring colleagues of yours that you think are going to benefit from this, because we will also have a fraud prevention checkup. I'm going to ask a couple of questions. You will answer those questions online, and you will be able to rate your extent of compliance. And in our third and fourth seminars, I'm going to be sharing some of my experience, tales from the dark side, actual fraud cases, and the lessons learned. We'll look at roles and responsibilities in the prevention of fraud from all levels, employees, managers, the audit committee, as well as directors. Standards are evolving in forensic accounting, and we'll go through some of the global standards that we've got and try and learn from best practice. I'd like to get some comments on what are the fraud risk areas that you view in your organization, because in our last seminar, I'm going to take one or two examples, and we'll actually go through what fraud risk management looks like. So it's either going to be procurement, payroll, billing cycle. You can let me know, and depending on how many requests we've got, I'll choose one or two and we'll go into that. And then we'll look at a fraud and corruption control system. It used to be called a plan, but these days they're calling it a system because people were shelving plans, but a system is something that you've got to work with. We'll also look at codes of conduct and the implementation, and then we'll finally wrap up. So to start us off with, what is fraud? Let's look at the legal elements of fraud. If you're going to prove fraud in court, there are a couple of things that you have to be able to prove, and the burden of proof is always with the person that's bringing the case. The first thing is that the statement has to be material and it has to be false. The second part is that the statement was false and it was uttered with the intention to defraud. The third part is that the victim relied on that false statement, so there was deceit. You knew, or the fraudster knew, when they were going to commit the fraud, that somebody was going to rely on it and they were going to take advantage of that reliance. And finally, there's going to be damages or presumed damages resulting from the victim's reliance on the false statement. This is a bell curve of people, all of us. And you can see there in the green that we have honest people, and some people are honest all of the time. And then in the red, we can see that we've got dishonest people, and some people are dishonest all of the time. Something in their life has just dropped them off that slippery slope, and now they're just dishonest. Those people represent the highest risk, and if you let them into your organization at your peril. And then there's the yellow bit, which is most people are honest some of the time, and some people are honest most of the time. And these are the potential fraudsters that we're looking at controlling through everything we do as it relates to fraud risk management. There are many theories that fraud experts have come up with, and this is the most famous one. It's called the fraud triangle, but there are a couple of others, you'll see them. I think fraud professionals love figures. So we've got a triangle, we've got a rectangle, we've got a pentagon, we've got a hexagon. And perhaps if you've got children at university, anybody who's doing a PhD, you might want to come up with the fraud septagon. So there are three factors or three dimensions to the fraud triangle. The first one is the need or pressure. And this is where the employee needs funds for lifestyle or for habits. And the pressure could come from a family member who's sick. It could be personal circumstances, children's education, somebody's death, a divorce. And the fraudster has no legitimate way of getting those funds to meet those pressures that they have, and therefore they resort to fraud. The other thing is unrealistic expectations, particularly from employers. Some employers have such high targets and such high expectations from various departments that sometimes this pressure to actually falsify accounts just to keep the job. And then there could be addiction. Some people get into all kinds of bad habits, and then they try and get money to fund those bad habits. Or it could just be greed. Somebody's found an open door in the organization. Nobody's looking at it. He's seen it's an easy loophole. He tests it and it works, and then he gets greedy. And the other dimension is the opportunity, which is weak controls or the lack of controls altogether, or it could be turnover at key positions, or more importantly, reliance at key positions, or entirely on one or two individuals when you start up new operations. For example, you might have a new branch or a new business that you venture into, and you're relying on one key individual to set all of it up, to set up the controls and everything else, and that's a key risk. Lack of oversight and segregation, related party transactions, or just using estimates in a business as opposed to real numbers. And the third thing, and this is really interesting, is how fraudsters rationalize their behavior. When something happens to them, they are able to justify taking money from their employers. And either they take the money and it's either because I didn't get that raise that I was due. You know, I worked just as hard as my next door guy, and he got the raise, but I didn't get it. So I'm going to take a little bit of money just so, you know, I'm equal with the other guy. Or my employer has been very unfair. He's been overworking me. He's a nasty guy, and I'm just going to, I'm going to get equal. So it could be any one of those things. This is the fraud diamond that I talked about. And one other factor was added here, which is capability. And that's basically that the fraudster has to be able to commit the fraud. And we'll see when we look at people with long tenures, the longer a person stays in the organization, the more able they're, the more frauds they're able to commit, and the greater is their fraud loss to the organization. So that's the fourth factor in the fraud diamond. Then we go to the fraud pentagon. And here you've got arrogance. And these are people who basically feel they're beyond the law, that the organization's policies and procedures don't apply to them. These people can be psychologically, they can be, you know, what we call a psycho. Yeah, because they will not empathize with other employees. They will not empathize with the victim organization. So that's that particular, and you can see the red flags with people like this. And then you've got the fraud hexagon, whereby our Mr. Vucinus in 2019 added what he's called character. And basically what he said was that everybody has an upbringing, they have moral values, their background, their circumstances, and they bring that to play in the organization when we hire them. And those are the lenses that they look at the organization through. So it's pretty important to understand the character of an individual as well. Let's go straight into the report to the nations 2022. This is a report on occupational fraud. The ACFE, which is the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, have been doing this report biannually, once every 2 years, since 1996. And this is the largest report of its kind in the world. Fraud experts, such as myself, certified fraud examiners from all over the world, contribute their cases to this study in terms of the data that they have, and that is what makes this survey possible. This particular survey was unique because it was done in the year 2020, 2021 through to early 2022, and this is the time of the pandemic. And as we know, the last 2 years have been like no other. We've all worked from home. We've had to rely on remote communication. There's been a lack of one-to-one contact. So, you know, the red flags that we'd normally rely on when you're talking to a person and when you're assessing their response, I mean, those have been away. Sometimes it's just a voice at the other end of the other line that we've talked to. So this particular survey was done in those circumstances, and that makes it particularly relevant. I think I can proudly say this survey was released last week, and I think I can confidently say that we're the first ones to bring the findings of this survey, certainly in Africa, and we might actually be the first to go to market with this survey, perhaps globally. So kudos to BDO. That's good to know that, you know, we've got a first in this regard. Let's look at the global cost of fraud. The survey examined 2,110 cases in 133 countries. The total losses from those cases was $3.6 billion. The average loss per case, which is basically dividing the total loss by the number of cases, 210, was $1,783,000. and 21% of those cases had losses over $1 million. The survey estimates that 5% of all revenue is lost to fraud each year. That's an average loss. So basically, whether you're aware that fraud happens in your organization or not, this is a statistic that would apply to everybody. And it's just a question of, it may not have happened to you in 1 year, it may happen in the 2nd year or in the 3rd year, but when you do get hit, that's the kind of damage that it's going to do to your organization. And when we look at the projected figures, we're looking at a gross world produce of 94.94 trillion. When you turn that to fraud, we're looking at 4.7 trillion lost to fraud globally. You can see that's a staggering number. Now let's look at the loss per case per region. And I'll take you through some quick definitions. First of all, percentile, median. So median is the middle number. If you have, say, for example, a spread of 11 numbers, median is the 6th number. So you'll have 5 below and you'll have, 5 below and you'll have 5 above, and that 6th number is the median. And the same thing, and so the median is the 50th percentile. And the 25th percentile is where 25% of all the cases were below that, and 75% were above, and so on and so forth. So let's look at the statistics. At the 25th percentile, the median loss was 20,000. The median loss was 117,000, which means 50% of all cases had a loss greater than $117,000. And when we look at the 75th percentile, the median loss was 600,000, which means that 50% of those cases had a loss between 117 and 600,000, whereas 25% of all cases had a loss greater than 600,000. When we look at the loss per region, we can see substantial differences at the median level and also at the 75 percentile level. For example, if you look at Eastern Europe, you look at Western, Central Asia, the median loss, the 75 percentile loss is 1,125,000. Latin America and Caribbean, as well as Middle East and North Africa, close to the 1 million mark. Compared with our region, Sub-Saharan Africa, the median loss was 352,000. So in those other countries, the losses were 4 times or 3.5 times as large. We're going to look at 5 critical areas and the data collected in these 5 critical areas. We're going to look at the methods by which occupational fraud is committed. We're going to look at how frauds are detected, the characteristics of organizations, the characteristics of people who commit fraud, and the results of the cases. We're going to do the first 2 today, and then the next 3 in the next webinar. So looking at cases reported per region, I think in this last survey, we meaning Sub-Saharan Africa, had a fairly good representation. 429 cases were reported by CFEs, certified fraud examiners, to the ACFE, which represented 23% of the entire population. So I can safely say that our figures are going to be representative of the frauds that happen to us. And that is, we're going to go down that via department and also via industry. So that's going to be quite useful. Looking at occupational fraud, there are 3 types of occupational fraud. There's asset misappropriation, financial fraudulent financial fraud in statements, financial fraud in financial statements, and corruption. Corruption is examples, conflict of interest, bribery, and asset misappropriation basically is the theft of assets, whether it's cash or non-cash. It could be inventory, plant and machinery, your soft assets, and so on and so forth. So these are the 3 broad categories. And the ACFE have deliberately put these categories, have categorized them like this, because from 1996 to date, these categories haven't changed. Even though we've got globalization, we've got IT advances, all of the frauds still happen in these three categories. So these three categories have stood the test of time. Looking at fraud types, we can see that the largest fraud at the bottom, financial statement fraud, has the largest median loss at $593,000, but only happens in 9% of the cases. Whereas corruption and asset misappropriation have median losses of 100,000, 150,000, and by and far the largest fraud is asset misappropriation. So we're going to go into details in that particular category, which represents 86% of all the cases that we investigated. This is the fraud taxonomy, and what we see here is the different kinds of frauds that are perpetrated in those three categories. So for example, when you look at asset misappropriation, you've got cash, theft of cash receipts, you've got skimming. Skimming is where cash is taken out from an organization before it's recorded. And you've also got cash larceny, which is cash removed from the organization after it's been recorded. You've got frauds in sales, receivable frauds, refunds, unrecorded or understated, understatement of frauds. You've got lapping schemes, and then you've got some frauds that are not concealed. And likewise, you've got financial systems frauds. And then you've also got fraud in terms of misuse of assets and just theft of other assets. Why is this important? I'm going to go back to our example. We looked at the weapons of the fraudster in that example, and we were scanning for weapons. Now, these are the weapons. These are the frauds that are going to happen in your organization. And therefore, you need to know what these frauds are. And particularly the people in charge of, so for example, your line managers, your internal audit people, directors, executives, all of them, as well as employees, all of them need to be aware of the key frauds that can be perpetrated in their areas of operation, and what are the red flags for these frauds. The survey looked at whether fraudsters committed one type of fraud, and what they found was that in nearly 40% of cases, fraudsters did more than one fraud. So if you add, for example, asset misappropriation, 32%, and then you add another 5% for corruption, misappropriation, and financial statement, and then the 2% and the 1% at the bottom, that's 40%. So 40% of all frauds were in all three areas, basically. Well, the fraudster didn't just do one type of fraud, he committed all these frauds. This is a heat map for asset misappropriation. So on those two axes, on the one axis, you've got the scale of the fraud, the amount, and that's the median amount. And on the bottom axis, on the vertical axis, you've got the frequency or the number of cases, the percentage of fraud. So obviously anything to the right and anything up there happened more, and it had a bigger impact. So the biggest cases and the biggest impact came from billing, from check and payment tempering, and from non-cash, whereas the least impact was felt from registered disbursements and disbursements fraud, and from frauds, cash on hand, direct cash theft. This is the same graphic, but in numbers for the accountants among us, the number lovers among us. And basically you can see here, it's sorted by the percentage of cases. So you've got billing right at the top with a high median loss. So anything that's got a high percentage as well as a high median loss is high risk. And the reason this is useful is when you do your fraud risk assessment, you know where to start. You got to start with the areas that are highest risk, and then go your way down. When you're doing annual checks, that's the same thing. If you've already got fraud risk assessments and you want to test those fraud risk assessments, make sure you don't leave out high risk areas. Let's look at fraud duration and median loss. Here we can see that the median loss increases with fraud duration. So the longer a fraud goes on, the higher is the loss. You can see only 6% of cases went on or were undetected for more than 60 months, so more than 5 years, but you can see the amount that was lost. So if you've got people, if you've got fraudsters in your organization and they perpetrate that fraud, the longer they're allowed to perpetrate the fraud, the longer is going to be the impact. And you can see the direct correlation there. Fraud duration by type. So here what we've done is we've looked at the duration of fraud in these particular asset misappropriation categories. And we can see that the ones that are that last the least are registered disbursements and non-cash frauds and corruption, all of them at 12 months, whereas the ones that have taken the longest to detect are billing frauds and check and payment tampering, as well as expense reimbursements. The next thing we look at is fraud velocity by fraud types. And what we can see here is, first of all, what's fraud velocity? Fraud velocity is simply the loss divided by the number of months. So what we're trying to show here is the rate at which you're losing money if you're hit by a fraud in any one of these categories. And again, we can see by far, financial statement fraud had the highest rate of losses. I mean, that was the rate of loss per month, $32,900, followed by corruption, $12,500, followed by non-cash items, $6,500, and right at the bottom there, registered disbursements or disbursements frauds, $800. Now let's look at fraud velocity, and let's look at fraud velocity as it relates to the number of perpetrators, the seniority of the people in the organization, as well as the size of the organization. So starting with perpetrators, what we can see is, and that's the top 3 lines, the more the perpetrators, the greater is the velocity, that greater is the loss per month. So if you've got 3 or more perpetrators, you're losing $18,300 per month. And if you've only got 1, your loss is lower, it's $4,800. So what this tells us is, if your fraud is unchecked and more people get into fraud loss, the greater is going to be the loss. I'm going to discuss in our 3rd seminar, when we look at actual cases, I'm going to be talking about a case whereby the entire department was involved in the fraud. And the only people that had no knowledge of it until the fraud was obviously found was top management and executives. Amazing. So the next category is the seniority, and that's the middle 3 lines. You've got employees, managers, and executives. And again, predictably, owners and executives took a lot longer for the fraud to be discovered, and the losses were much larger. I mean, you can, especially with owners and executives, you can see they hit the organization hardest, $18,700 loss per month. And it took the longest time. And why is this? And this is because obviously they're senior, so they have more access to controls. They have the ability to override controls. And also because they are senior, they can intimidate and they can bully other employees. So people might not report them just because they're afraid. And then lastly, the last 2 lines, we look at organizations with employees less than 100 and organizations that have more than 100 employees. And here we can see that the median loss in smaller organizations was higher, and the median duration in smaller organizations was also higher perhaps because they had less resources, and perhaps because they were less committed. So to summarize that, a typical fraud case is going to have a median loss of nearly $100,000 per annum, and it's going to last for 12 months. Interestingly, whether we had 3 fraudsters or just one, all frauds were detected in about 12 months. So that's quite an interesting fact. Even when fraudsters collude, if we go looking for those frauds, we can still find them in 12 months. We can find them in 1 year. And so that's pretty interesting. Now, what does this figure of $100,000 per month, per annum tell you about the kind of investment you're going to make? You've got 2 choices. You can either invest this money in your organization and proactively try and stop fraud, or you can choose it. You can choose to give it to the fraudsters. I think that's the message from this one slide. So how do fraudsters conceal their frauds? These are the 5 concealment methods. And you can see why it's important for us to look at these methods. 39% created fraudulent physical documents. 32% altered those documents. 28% created fraudulent electronic documents. And 25% altered electronic documents or files, and 23% destroyed or simply withheld physical documents. Why is this important? Again, it's important because if we don't know how fraudsters commit these frauds, we're not going to be able to protect our data. So this information tells you that you've got to safeguard your physical documents. You've got to safeguard your physical documents from alteration. Auditors have to look at scrutinized documents for alteration. And you've also got to have audit trail on your electronic documents as well. And custody. Custody is pretty important because fraudsters will destroy documents. So it's pretty important. The moment your source documents have found their way into your systems, they're stored away safely, and nobody is able to access those documents, save a few people. So 12% of fraud cases did not involve any attempts to conceal the fraud, but by and large, 88% of cases, the fraud was concealed. And this is obvious because fraudsters don't want to get caught. They want to continue with their merry ways for as long as they can. Of those, 57% of cases involved the creation of fraudulent evidence. 52% altered existing evidence, and 37% deleted or destroyed evidence. And when you look at evidence, 38% of all the cases involved concealment methods affecting both the physical as well as electronic evidence. Now let's look at concealment by position. How are they hiding those weapons? And what we can see is 48% simply got rid of them. So your executive level perpetrators, we're talking about executives and the board, people at the highest levels, they simply destroyed the evidence, whereas at levels below that, so we're looking at managers and all of the employees, their frauds consisted of creating fraudulent evidence. Now let's look at occupational trends in fraud for the last decade. And this is an interesting graphic. What we can see here is that median losses, as well as the median duration of frauds, has come down. And this is good news for all of us because it means that the efforts of organizations, of boards, of audit committees, of internal auditors, as well as anti-fraud experts like ourselves are paying off. It's becoming more difficult for fraudsters to commit fraud. Their rewards from fraud are decreasing and they're getting caught faster. And this is only good news. So really, we've got to keep doing what we're doing. Now looking at criminal versus civil action, and we can see less people from 2012 to 2022, less organizations are resorting to criminal action. In 2012, it was 65% of all organizations chose to take criminal action. And by 2022, it was 58%. And I guess that's to do with, first of all, the recoveries that they achieve through criminal cases, but also the reputational damage they suffer, fines, as well as just the inherent costs and the time involved. And when we look at civil cases, it's gone the other way. So in 2012, only 23% of cases had a civil component. There were civil suits, whereas by 2022, it had gone up to nearly 30%. And again, that's good news. Now let's look at fraud trends, men versus women. And here, from the very beginning, from 1996 through to 2022, every single survey, men take the prize. Men have committed the largest number of frauds compared with women. In 2012, men did 65% of the frauds compared with 35% by women. But by this year or last year, men comprised 73% of all cases compared with 27% by women. So there's less fraudsters amongst women and there's more fraudsters amongst men in our times. However, the interesting statistic is the median loss. It seems like women have got emboldened in this last decade. In 2012, frauds by men had a median loss of 200,000, whereas frauds by women had a loss of only 91,000. But by 2020, frauds both by male as well as female perpetrators were nearly the same, 125. So female fraudsters have become more bold and they're stealing just as much money as their men counterparts. Levels of authority. And what we've seen here, and this is a disturbing trend, is that more cases now in 2022 than a decade ago. 62% of the cases that we investigated compared with 56%. I'm not sure whether this is just because we went through the 2 years, pandemic 2 years, whether this was exceptional. You can see the trend, 2016, 2018, 2020, you can see it was more or less there. But in that period of the pandemic, the managers, executives, and owners have outdone the employees in terms of fraud. 62% done by that group and 38% done by the rest of the employees. When we look at corruption and collaboration, the trends, we can see, and again, this is bad news. There's much more corruption. Corruption is on the rise. In 2012, it was only 33% of all the cases we investigated. And by 2022, it's 50% of all the cases we investigated. And fraudsters are collaborating more. I'm not sure whether it's just internet access or what it is, but there's a lot more collaboration amongst fraudsters. In 2012, only 42% of the cases had more than 2 perpetrators, but this was up to 58% by 2022. So this could be because we've been through a period of tough times. If you remember, the last 2 years, there was loads of job losses. There was a lot of uncertainty. There was wages reductions in many organizations. There was layoffs. And basically because people have been through hard times, I think that trend probably does have an explanation. Let's look at the fraud trends over a decade and look at the controls. So we've got very good news here, and that is we look at about 17 or 18 controls altogether, and this is for the next webinar. But here we're looking at the trends, so I'm going to touch on this as part of the trends analysis. And we can see that 17 out of those 18 controls have actually risen. This is good news because it means fraud awareness, fraud training, and fighting fraud has become more of part of our strategy than it was a decade ago. And the biggest success has been in hotlines. 70% of all cases had a hotline, and fraud training, again, 61% of cases had fraud training, 60% of cases had an anti-fraud policy, 59% of all cases had fraud training, not just for employees, but also for managers and executives, and that's commendable. And there were 46% formal fraud risk assessments. Having said that, really, there was an increase in fraud. You really want to see all of those percentages at 100%. So any gaps, even though we're at 46 to 70%, any gap there is an opportunity for improvement. It's an opportunity to stop fraudsters from taking money out of your organization. Now let's look at the profile of a fraudster. Familiar faces, I think, to all of us here, starting with the bottom right. That's Mr. Bernie Madoff, the largest Ponzi scheme in history, with billions in losses. Top left, the lady there is Jyoti Dilawri, Goldman Sachs. The judge referred to her as the Picasso of con artists. Middle top is Ken Lay, the CEO of the bankrupt Enron. 22,000 employees lost their jobs. Enron had a turnover before it collapsed of over 100 billion. Bottom left, Vijay Mallya, chairman of the now collapsed Kingfisher Airlines. Unfortunately, he escaped to London and he's living there since 2014. They haven't been able to extradite him to India for his crimes. And top right is Alan Greenspan. Alan Greenspan spearheaded the complete deregulation of the financial industry, which led to the great Wall Street ripoff, the collapse, big collapse in 2008. It consisted, if you remember, of selling fraudulent mortgage-backed securities and thereby creating a financial bubble. And when the bubble burst, what happened? It destroyed trillions of dollars worth of real investment. It crippled the entire globe. The entire globe went into a recession. It created massive unemployment throughout the world. And until today, until now, organizations are still suffering losses from back in 2008, and we still haven't recovered from that. So this is by far and large the greatest fraud that we've seen in our times. And sad to say, Alan Greenspan was just one of the players, but the deregulation was led by ministers, who voted all these laws into effect, which allowed banks and other financial institutions to just act in a very different way to they're acting today. Now let's look at the perpetrators. You can see here owners and executives. They committed 23% of all occupational frauds, but they caused the largest loss by far. So 337,000 compared with 125,000 for managers and 50,000 for employees. 85% of the fraudsters in this survey had displayed at least one behavioral red flag. So if we were looking for those red flags, it's quite possible we could have caught the frauds earlier and we could have prevented some of those losses. You're not going to be able to prevent all of them. For certain, fraudsters are devising ingenious ways of stealing quicker than we can stop them. So there's always going to be fraud, but we can certainly catch it faster, and we can reduce the damage. Now let's look at fraudsters' authority versus the fraud loss. And we can see the direct correlation here. The first 3 bars to the left, owners and executives, they had the largest loss, even though the percentage of cases was only 23%, compared with managers and employees. So if you add those 2 numbers, the 23% and the 39% on this slide, you can see that 62% of all frauds in the cases that we reviewed were done by managers and owner executives. Now let's look at the perpetrator's authority versus duration. How does the perpetrator's level of authority relate to the fraud? And we can see here that owners and executives, their frauds lasted the longest, for 18 months. And for managers, it was 16 months. And for other employees, it was 8 months. And this is directly related to their levels of authority. They obviously have more authority. They're able to cover their tracks. And they're also able to use intimidation and bullying tactics to basically perpetrate their frauds for longer periods. Let's now look at the tenure, the perpetrator's tenure. How does the perpetrator's tenure relate to occupational fraud? And here what we can see is that the longer people remain in our organizations, the greater is the damage that they can do. So if you look at frauds or cases of frauds less than 1 year, only 9% of all the cases we reviewed were less than 1 year, and the median loss was 50,000. If you look at the other 2 on your right, and you add those 2, you're looking at the people who are probably going to be the most loyal, the most trusted in your organization, those who've had 6 years or more of employment. And you can see nearly 50% of all cases were ascribed to these 2 categories, and they constituted the highest losses. So this is quite a telling graphic. People in our organization not only hit us with bigger frauds, but they become smarter, they learn more about the organization, they learn more about the loopholes, they build more trust, and that is why they're able to commit larger frauds, even though they've been with the organization for much longer. Next, let's look at the perpetrator's department. And the 2 axes here, on the horizontal axis, you've got the median loss, and on the vertical axis, you've got the frequency, the percentage of cases. So when you look at it, anything to your right and high up there is more risk and more damaging. And the 2 departments right up there, as we would have expected, is the board of directors and executive upper management. And primarily because a lot of those frauds were frauds that involved financial statement frauds. But if you go down and you look at other departments and you start from the extreme right, you'll find operations is another big area. Accounting is another big area. Sales, purchasing and finance, all of those are big areas where fraud happens. So my question to the participants today, what departments do you come from, and how can you take your learning from today's webinar back to those departments and make a difference? This is the same information, but basically We've shown it by number of cases from up down. Again, you can see operation had the highest number of cases, followed by accounting, and those in executive and upper management roles. But the median losses were highest amongst the board of directors, right there in the middle. And then the third line, upper executive management, median loss of 500,000 for each, significantly higher than in any other department. If you look at the next highest loss is in accounting, 155,000, and then in IT, 150,000, and then in purchasing, procurement, 129,000. Let's look at the perpetrators, tenure versus authority. And what we see here is that fraudsters who have remained in employment for longer are stealing 3 times more than those who've been in employment for shorter periods. So you look at everybody who's been in employment for less than 5 years, median loss 90,000. You look at everybody who's been in employment for 6 years and above, and that's 250,000. Even comparing fraudsters with similar level of authority, the longer they served, the higher the losses. So if you look at the blue lines on the infographic on the right side, the blue lines represent fraudsters who had service of 6 years and above. And the white lines represent fraudsters with a service of 5 years and below. And what you can see there is owners and executives had the highest median losses compared with owners and executives who had served for longer. So it reinforces the fact that the longer people remain in our organization, fraudsters remain in our organization, the bigger are going to be their frauds. So really, you can't underscore the point that if there are fraudsters, if your background checks have revealed that there's fraudsters, you need to try and get rid of them. If people are displaying red flags, which is something we're going to go into next week, we're going to go into a lot of detail about how to recognize red flags amongst employees and in particular departments and in particular fraud areas, what we can do about it. Now let's look at long-term employees versus short-term employees and how that relates to collusion and the time it took to catch them. So what we can see, the line in the red in the first graph on the left is for employees who had served 6 years and above, and the line in the white is for employees who had served 5 years and less. And we can see there that the longer people serve in our organizations, the more they're likely to collude. And now coming to the infographic on the right, the longer people serve, the longer it's going to take to catch them. So people above 6 years, it actually took 24 months, even though the median was 12, if you can remember. For longer serving employees, it could take up to 24 months. We've seen organizations, I have personally seen organizations where frauds have happened or have been allowed to continue for more than 5 years with serious consequences for the organization. And if we look at less tenured fraudsters, so we're looking at now fraudsters, the white bar is less than 5 years, and the red bar in the first graph is for more than 6 years. We can see that less tenured fraudsters are more likely or twice as likely to have been previously fired or punished for fraud-related conduct. And if we look at the infographic on the right, less tenured fraudsters were more likely to have had a criminal record in their past compared with longer serving employees. Now let's look at red flags. And these are the only ones we are going to look at before we wind up today's session. Again, the red bars are for employees who've served for 10 years and more, and the blue bars are for employees that have served for 5 years or less. Sorry, the red bar is for employees that have served for 6 years and more, not 10 years. So if we look at that, the biggest red flag, and this has been a constant finding in every survey that was done by ACFE since 1996, living beyond their means. So it's not very difficult to catch fraudsters, because fraudsters love to reward themselves. And you can see drastic changes in their lifestyle within months of the first successful fraud. So if somebody's been doing it for 10 years, I mean, they're going to have an extremely lavish lifestyle, living far beyond their means. And unfortunately, when we look at government today, we see this. We see, unfortunately, people in government, with assets far in excess of their means, of their pays. The second flag was an unusually close association with vendors. And again, we can see that fraudsters who had served for longer periods displayed more of this. So maybe it's arrogance, maybe they just get relaxed. But these red flags, all of them were found with people, with employees who had been in employment for longer. Control issues, unwillingness to share duties. How many of us know people with control issues and unwillingness to share duties in our organizations? I'm not saying they're all fraudsters, but perhaps, it's something that we should be looking at a little bit, with a little bit more scrutiny. Bullying and intimidation. How many of us know, okay, that happens in our organization, particularly some departments, it's going to be like a no zone. Nobody goes there because, you've got a Mr. Tough in there. Or for the next one, irritability, suspiciousness, or defensiveness. How many of us know employees who are extremely irritable, very unapproachable, and very defensive when you ask them about anything? And then there's the personal family problems. Either it's a recent divorce or it's family problems, a split up, etc., a death in the family. 15% of them showed warning signs, but were still allowed to continue in their organizations. Let's look at the schemes based on the perpetrator's department. And this is a useful infographics when you're looking at doing fraud risk management in your organizations. The darker colors represent the areas of higher risk. And on one side, you've got the departments. So you've got the 8 departments that we've selected: operations, accounting. These 8 departments represented the most significant number of cases. 76% of all fraud cases happened in these 8 departments. So we've singled out these 8 departments and we've put colors there. So you can take this back, and the next time you're doing your fraud risk assessment, you know where to focus. Nearly half of all occupational frauds came from these 4 departments alone. Operations, 15%, accounting, 12%, executive and upper management, 11%, and sales, 11%. Let's look at the gender distribution of perpetrators by region. This is another interesting infographic. If we look at South Asia, for example, you can see 95% of fraudsters were men, and only 5% of the fraud cases involved women. If you look at home, Sub-Saharan Africa, we had a 25%, 75% distribution. So 1/4 of all the fraud cases involved women, and 3/4 of all fraud cases involved men. You can see there's quite a large disparity. If you look at United States and Canada, I think that's where the women have been the most emboldened. You found nearly 40% of frauds were committed by women compared with 60% men. Interesting graphic. Let's look at the position of the perpetrator based on gender. And here you can see that men compared with women had much greater losses. So starting at the bottom, men who were in executive or owner roles, their median loss was 446,000. Yeah, and there was 82% of those were men and 18% of those were women. So in the cases involving owners and executives, the losses from women were much smaller and they represented a much smaller percentage. When you look at manager, it's a similar trend. 75% of all the cases were men, whereas 25% of them were women. But interestingly, the median losses for both managers and employees were the same. 50,000 for employees and 120,000 for managers, regardless of whether it was done by men or by women. If we look at the perpetrator's age, what we find is there's a bell curve there. And if you add the age, if you add the ages, the third line, the fourth and the fifth, so say from 31 years all the way to 45 years, that's when people are like in their prime, 31 to 45, 15% plus 20% plus 19%, that's 54%. 54% of all the cases, fraud cases, came from this age group. But if you go to the extreme right, our wazais, the above 60-year-olds, even though they only accounted for 3% of the cases, they accounted for, their median loss was 800,000, which was by and far the largest loss of any group. Perpetrators' education level. And what we can see here is what we expect, that people with university degrees and postgraduate degrees had the highest median losses, and also the cases were the highest. 18 and 47, 65% of all cases just from people with a university degree or above, and their losses were greater. So obviously they probably tend to occupy higher positions, and because they occupy higher positions, they're able to commit larger frauds and more frauds. And collusion by multiple perpetrators, you can see here in 8% of the cases right at the bottom, when there were 3 or more perpetrators, you had the highest median loss of $219,000. When there was only 2 perpetrators, the median loss was smaller, $145,000. And 1 perpetrator, which was most of the cases, you had a median loss of $57,000. So the more people that get involved in frauds, the higher is the loss to the organization. Criminal background. Interestingly, 87% of all cases never had a conviction and they were never charged. And only 7% of those had been charged. But interestingly, in spite of a background check, they were allowed into the organization. And 6% of them had prior convictions. And if you look at the perpetrator's employment history, 83% of them had never been punished for any misconduct or terminated, whereas 9% were previously punished and 8% were previously terminated. So again, some red flags there, perhaps not properly investigated. And lastly here, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. I'm going to leave you with this last slide, which speaks for itself about some of the services that we provide. It's been a pleasure hosting you. I look forward to all of you joining me for our second webinar, which I hope is going to cover the rest of the report, the 2022 report, as well as start on some very exciting topics which I shared with you in the agenda. Thank you very much, and over to you, Moses.
Thanks, Zahir. Thank you so much for keeping this as interactive as it's been, and especially for keeping the language very relatable. I must say there's been a number of interesting statistics there. Some are obvious, some are new. The men were obviously expected to be more prone to commit fraud than the women. And I must say at that point, I went to see how many gentlemen we have and how many ladies we have, and the response was obvious. Right. So having said that, I think that this has been very helpful. We've learned that fraud really happens at all levels, right from the executive to the bottommost position. And so it's important for all of us to strengthen our operational systems and have systems that can detect and prevent the fraud at any levels. So our time is fast spent, I must say. But we have a few questions in the chat section. So here, I wonder if you can take about 2, and we shall have the rest responded to as and when we are sending the certificates.
Okay.
Yeah. Are you
thanks, Moses. Yeah, thanks, Moses. Yes. So one of the questions was, what do I do if I suspect fraud in my organization? I think it's a pretty pertinent question. What's the first thing we should do as soon as you're suspicious of fraud? So a couple of tips. All frauds are going to be different, and you're going to have a different approach. But generally speaking, the first thing you need to do is to safeguard your potential evidence. Safeguard the weapons. So basically, get hold of those. Preservation of evidence is key. If the fraud is very large, you're going to have to prove the loss in court or to your insurer. So you need to preserve the evidence. Secure any and all potential evidence. But by all means, don't start examining the evidence yourself. Did you know that by simply turning on a computer or even switching it off, okay, you may have tampered with evidence? So secure the evidence, but then call experts to come in and look at the evidence. Secure, what do you want to secure? You want to secure anything that's relating physically. You want to secure your computers. You want to secure the victims or the perpetrator's computer, cell phone, any external media devices, such as thumb drives, and so on and so forth. And securing this evidence will help the fraud investigation team to identify what's happened. And then if you are going to take this matter to court, to present the evidence in an admissible way. I think the next thing you want to do is you want to gather a team. So enlist a forensic accountant, as well as a fraud specialist, a computer specialist, a computer forensic specialist, and get hold of them, and they will help you to analyze, collect, and store any data that may be needed. It would be wise to hire, obviously, external investigators, because hiring internal investigators may or may not be appropriate. First of all, internal people may be involved, or they may have some other interest. But if they have the relevant experience, then by all means, use your internal team. Also, at this stage, you might consider retaining a lawyer, who can deal with the employment issues, the HR issues, so that you're always on the right side of the law regarding the rights of the suspect employee. The next thing you want to do is deal appropriately with the suspected employee. So don't fire the employee. Instead, send them on leave and make sure that you've restricted the access of that employee to company data. Don't let them remove their computer or any other company items from their offices. Secure their offices, secure all the equipment, and basically give them time to for the investigation to proceed. I think the next thing that you want to do is to inform your insurer. And this is pretty important because some insurance policies will have a 30 days period, up to 60 days to notify about the loss. So failure to do this within the right timeframes, it may invalidate your cover. So inform your insurer straight away. The next thing is file proof of the loss. So get together all your documents and document the loss. Quickly get an expert to come and quantify the losses in a manner in which the insurance company can understand. So documenting a claim is going to take longer than you expect. So give yourself enough time. If you need to, you can file an extension with the insurance company. So you've got enough time to actually give them all of the documents to be able to, for them to be able to assess the claim. I think these are the 5 things that you need to do straight away. Thanks, Moses. Moses, you're...
Zahir, thanks. Quite insightful there once again. So Zahir, I think between you and I, we need to plan to have longer sessions for the next episodes. There's so much that we need to cover. I see a number of questions coming in. Unfortunately, we can't answer all of them within the time that we have. So I'm just going to request that from all that we've learned today, Zahir, the questions that you've answered, the insights that you've shared with us, in just 1 minute, what do you think is the key takeaway for us? What should we take home if we forget everything else?
I think the key takeaway is that if you're not doing what we've learned in your organizations, start. Because you're losing this money anyway. You just don't know about it. So I think that's the key takeaway. You've got to be doing these things.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you. So we've learned it's just 2 ways. You either prevent the fraud or you let it happen. And it's good to know that anti-fraud practitioners like yourself, Zahir, and the rest of the team at BDO are helping us make fraud less attractive than it would be if we were not here. Otherwise, this is all we had time for today. Would like to thank the over 350 participants that have joined us today. It's been a pleasure hosting you, especially as we get into the holidays. I recently sent someone the invite and they called me back and said they thought BDO has made so much money that we can now make free trainings of this nature. But I must say this is just one of the privileges you get from being associated with the brand. And we are doing this at no cost. So if by any chance your accounting team has requisitioned for facilitation for this training, I can confirm that's not coming to BDO. And if it's coming, it's a love sacrifice. It's unsolicited. So thank you so much. We will send a response to all the questions we've not responded to in detail. We'll send a detailed response as and when we are sharing our certificates. Otherwise, we wish you a very good evening. So here there's a couple of kind words for you in the chat section. After this, you might need to take off a minute or 2 and run through them. We thank you and wish you the very best. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.